All right, thank you all for being here. It's great to see so many people in the room. And I'm very happy to welcome our speaker today as part of Professor Rebecca Comey, as part of a sequence of events that we're hosting at CHLA, in part with a collaboration with the Center for Contemporary Theory at the University of Chicago, and in particular, a project directed by Professor Lisa Wedeen, who's with us today, as well as Renouel Hayek and Jennifer Pitts from Chicago. It's great to have you all here. Within a framework or a project that they're engaged in, that we're kind of in conversation with, and perhaps engaged in as well, on revolutionary disappointment. So I wanted to first start by thanking the 3CT and the Anis Maqdisi program for literature, and Professor Maher Jarrar in specific for their support of this sequence of events, and Raymond Brassier from the philosophy department, as well as the board designated funds at AUB for the support of this sequence of events. Also, thanks is due to Yannick Gold, who's done so much by way of organizing. I don't know where Yannick is. And our administrator, Randa Khairallah. All right, so let me just say a few things here about the sequence of events that we have and the constellation of speakers that we're hosting, which is, they're coming from very interesting places, from North America. I mean, the constellation is interesting. From North America, from Toronto, from Croatia, and Palestine. And each of our speakers will be dealing each on their own terms with the question of political disappointment, recalibration, and persistence despite defeat. We could qualify all these figurations of the political, we could think of these as figurations of the political, as different forms of untimeliness, a term I think I borrow from Rebecca's first book, morning sickness, which we have been reading, engaged in the seminar I'm teaching, and I think the students are here, which has been a very kind of important read for us. But these disappointments, recalibrations, persistence despite defeat as forms of untimeliness in relation to historical experience. We could also recount disappointment, melancholy, mourning, failure, persistence, living on, overliving. I mean, I think we can continue to add to these figurations of untimeliness, or perhaps affective staying with or not being without a certain attachment, which seem to assume all of them a kind of a political subject that is divided by a dialectic of anticipation and disappointment. Perhaps we could also think of this political subject as a subject oscillating between anxiety and courage. And obviously, considering these questions from here in Beirut, in particular, at this historical conjuncture or moment, becomes pressing given the intense constellation of crises that we continue to endure, albeit despite or amidst disagreements on how to name these crises or how to signify them, which could potentially have to do with a sense of lag or delay or disappointment or feeling out of time with our historical experience. So in a sense, I think our series in many ways addresses the question of the political as being increasingly marked by a sense of a décalage or a separation, and a kind of a not coming together. Something's always too late, maybe never too late, rather perhaps also extremely urgent in a sense that we have to grasp the massive disappointments of our present that we're all living with. However, although these divisions are over-determining, it does not seem to be that they render us to a sense of absolute defeat or failure as a kind of a fait accompli or as a finished task. And perhaps in the series of talks that we have, we're hoping to think through these problems, each speaker from their different position, maybe ultimately ask how can we unfail, how do we undo the primacy of failure without necessarily disavowing it. So I think this is kind of a general introduction to a sequence of talks that we're hosting until Friday. But this brings me to introducing our speaker today. I'm very honored to introduce Rebecca Koumé to everyone. Rebecca has been to Beirut a couple of times. We've had the pleasure to host her, I think, twice before at the university. Rebecca teaches philosophy and comparative literature at the University of Toronto. She works mainly on art, psychoanalysis, and philosophy in a broadly left Hegelian vein, which is a great term to keep alive. Her books include Morning Sickness, Hegel and the French Revolution from 2011, and The Dash, The Other Side of Absolute Knowing, co-authored with Frank Ruda in 2018. She has 2 collections of essays coming out. One is entitled On Persistence, which I would advise everyone to have on their reading list, and Material Remains in 2027. Rebecca has many publications, and I would kind of suffice to say that I'm very pleased and honored to have you here, and very much looking forward to your talk, which is entitled Lumpen Dialectic. All right, so yeah. And there's a handout, which I hope we have enough of, or if not, you can share. I think it's already circulated. And, there's more, if anyone wants.
Thank you so much, Nadia, for this lovely introduction, and Nadia and Lisa for making this happen and for letting me be part of this. It's really so great to be back at AUB, and I'm just really happy to be here and looking forward to the next few days. I also wanted to thank Yannick and Randa and all the other people. I'm sure there's more behind the scenes who've worked on all this. I know how much of a work it is to make these things happen, so thank you. I have to say, when Nadia first told me that this initiative was under the rubric of revolutionary disappointment, I kind of went, what? Because disappointment might be too mild-mannered a word to capture the horrors of relentless counter-revolution. Militant despair might be more apt, but it does capture the untimeliness and illegitimacy of the epoch. Disappointment as belatedness, a missed appointment, or assignation, or rendezvous. Disappointment as symbolic disinvestiture, the delegitimization of authority and office. Disappointment as disillusion, the demystification of progress and other Enlightenment canards. Within the Marxist tradition, which I'm largely going to be staying within today, for better or worse, the 18th Brumaire is the locus classicus for thinking about revolutionary failure, defeat, setback, or impasse, and all these terms should be distinguished, and I'll be returning to this well-trodden text. Everybody is reaching for the 18th Brumaire these days, an epoch of farcical imposture and authoritarian populism. It's an easy reach. But I've also recently been thinking about another tale of revolutionary failure, also written in the shadow of 1848. In The Peasant War in Germany, Engels revisits the scene of the 16th century peasants' insurrection and the ensuing slaughter, some 100,000 killed, which was a record breaker for the time. This year happens to be the 500th anniversary of that massacre, and there's been a frenzy of commemoration in Germany, exhibitions, conferences, operas, festivals, tourist pilgrimages, historical reenactments. I'm mentioning this because it's kind of astonishing given the memory politics of post-1945, let alone post-October 7th Germany. Perhaps the ballyhoo is supposed to distract from that. Perhaps it's supposed to compensate for the awfulness of the last centenary, when a demoralized and fragmented left, still reeling from the crushing of the Spartacist uprisings and the betrayal of the SPD, found it hard to draw inspiration from the peasants and their charismatic leader. In 1925, last time around, the taste of defeat was still bitter. Engels saw in the tragedy of 1525 the fatedness of a defeat that nonetheless bore a prophetic charge. The plebeians, as he called them, were afflicted by a double untimeliness that would simultaneously energize and undermine their revolutionary agency. Once these symptoms of a decaying feudalism and the first precursors of modern bourgeois society, the rebels under Thomas Müntzer were driven into a fast-forward flight backwards towards an atavistically millenarium future. So backwards, forwards, forwards, backwards. Yeah. Millenarianism has a funny way of messing with the calendar. A revolution against capital, before capital's settled dominion, would jam the gears of a locomotive that had yet to be fully assembled. Engels' insistence on the fatality of the peasant's defeat introduces the infamous theme of prematurity, justly castigated by anti-colonial revolutionary thinking for its developmental or stagist model of history that would consign most of the world's population to a catch-up game in which it is destined never to reach the finish line, the proverbial waiting room of history. Nonetheless, Engels comes within a hair's breadth of acknowledging, in what he calls the revolution of the common man, a radicalism that both he and Marx will notoriously deny to the lumpen proletariat and only half-heartedly grant the peasantry of 19th century France. This is what will make the German peasants' uprising so inspiring for the various peasant and decolonial insurrections of the 20th century, from China to Vietnam to the Zapatismo movement in Chiapas, Mexico. What if backwards Germany, whatever that stands for, rather than revolutionary France, were to offer another analogy for insurrection? These are just analogies, and possibly not the most apt ones. But why the compulsion to analogize at all? Analogies are magical things. When they're not stultifying or being commandeered to nefarious ends by the ruling powers, which is virtually all the time, they're energizing. They force a historical reckoning. They articulate elective affinities and affiliations. They forge alternative kinships and solidarities. Analogies channel what Walter Benjamin called the mimetic capacity or power. They extract similarities from a history that would otherwise atomize into a spray of disconnected particles or dissolve into a mush of sameness. Analogy is a historical sinew. It loosens the joints of a tradition that's become ossified and arthritic. Forgive the ableist language. And you have to say this in America. And it restores actuality, a kind of synchronicity to a time out of joint. Analogy is also a historical muscle. It contracts, condenses, thickens time. It stores energy like a battery. It's a time bomb that explodes the continuum of homogeneous empty time. This is why analogies are such a political minefield. Who gets to use them? Who gets to say fascism? Who gets to say apartheid? Who gets to say genocide? Who gets to say Holocaust? Who gets to prescribe or proscribe the terms of comparison or to grant the right to compare? Politics, as Benjamin once said of philosophy, is a struggle for the presentation of a limited number of names. Analogies are real estate in a colonial land grab where language is the terrain of an ongoing primitive accumulation. So I have to say before starting that I've started to feel a little stupid for ruminating on these 19th century arcana that I'm about to think about. It's probably time to loosen our fixation on 1848. There are other dates in the calendar, other tunes on the playlist of defeat, more dissonant, other examples more depressingly timely, more urgently depressing. But I still want to wend my way back to this text. There's many reasons to be reading the 18th Brumaire, Trump being possibly the least interesting in the end. But one reason I want to dwell on this text today is because it provides a robust theory of analogy. Analogy is trauma. Analogy is repetition, compulsion. Analogy is calendar. Analogy is the float and bloat of language. Analogy untethers words from their referential fixity, detaches dates from their chronological rigidity, detaches memory and mourning from the pieties of a memory culture that has become repressive and inert. Analogy is farce. Analogy is tragedy. Analogy is when you can't tell the difference. Okay. Now I start for real. If it didn't sound so cloyingly literary, I'd venture to say that there's nothing more tragic than a botched revolution. I'm cringing now as I say this, if only because tragedy is the favored trope of liberal historiography of revolution. The pathos of this formula is mirrored by the elegiac mood of left melancholia. The first scenario rehearses the litany of failure, the crashing of the loftiest ideals into the brutishness of their execution. The second scenario rehearses the litany of defeat, that is, the absorption of the most crushing disaster into the sublimity of the lost cause. Both scenarios aestheticize and dehistoricize in equal measure. The first collapses event into structure. Stripped of singularity, the revolution is harnessed to the wheel of fortune or the balefulness of human nature. The second collapses structure into event. Marooned from history, the time of revolution contracts into the eternal present of the missed opportunity and an endless eternal thermidor. In both cases, the invocation of tragedy has a sanitizing effect, a calming of the passions, a cleansing, one should rather say a dampening of the political imagination. Both scenarios provide the comforts of spectatorial immunity. The funeral meats are served up cold as victory feasts or as fodder for endless theoretical rumination. Both scenarios evacuate what's most tragic about revolution and occlude the revolutionary kernel of the tragic, the explosive power of its collisions, its blinding insights, its forced reconciliations, its most intractable antinomies, freedom and necessity, individual and collective, subjective agency and objective process. And the other revolutionary binaries, spontaneity and organization, mass and party, movement and goal, I think all basically unspool from this series of antinomies. Both scenarios quarantine the sorrow they keep evoking. Stripped of precedent and aftermath, suffering is rendered literally inconsequential. Mesmerized by the violence, we numb ourselves to the ongoing history of violence, of which revolution itself marks the punctuation. Spellbound by the trauma of the missed moment, we forget that the catastrophe is ongoing. The catastrophe is that everything keeps on going. And this is why we might have to reclaim the moribund category of the tragic. Can it be salvaged? If tragedy, like revolution, might seem to be tragically past its expiration date, and different reasons for this obsolescence have been offered from opposite sides of the political spectrum, the point is not to restore its grandeur, but to detonate what Benjamin called the revolutionary power of the outmoded. That is, to deploy the frayed remnants of tragedy so as to extract from obsolescence itself its explosive power. These fragments may prove to be the most stubborn remainders of the dialectic. Tragedy, revolution, dialectic, their tattered remnants are intertwined. If we were rag pickers, the salvage operation might go something like this: tragedy without fate, revolution without progress, dialectics without reconciliation. So here's a counterintuitive gamble. Benjamin described himself as a gleaner, rummaging through the garbage of the 19th century as Freud sifted through the detritus of the dream. What if it's the most moribund husks of the dialectic that prove to be its most serviceable remainder? So Aristotle famously contrasts poetry and history. He privileges poetry on modal or metaphysical grounds, where history just deals with contingencies, things that merely happen or happen to have happened. Poetry deals with possibilities, the kinds of things that could happen. That's why Aristotle considers poetry to be, in his words, more philosophical and more serious than history. It reveals in the morass of facts a crystal of counterfactual potential. It paints on a bigger canvas to show that a thing could happen, not merely that it did happen, but that it could happen, that it happened for a reason, is to recode an isolated event as a kind of event, repeatable, recognizable, generic, spilling over with counterfactual surplus. A person becomes a kind of person, a type, a category, a style, a brand. Oedipus becomes Oedipal. Hamlet, Hamletian. The proper name becomes adjectival, descriptive, exemplary, translatable, analogical. The name ceases to function as a rigid designator. It nominates or interpolates a person or date to a role, a title, an assignation, an institution. Caesar, the surname, becomes Caesar, the imperial title. Julius Caesar, the man, becomes a Caesar, a Tsar, a Kaiser. The name becomes more than a single person can bear. So the magnitude of tragedy can, in this sense, be uncoupled from the prestige of its protagonists or from any specific temporal or spatial duration or extension. Tragedy is more philosophical because it is simply more, just more. In bestowing on the event a nimbus of exemplarity, poetry raises it to conceptual dignity. But this also implies, although Aristotle does not engage this thought, that such things might not happen, that they need not have occurred, that possibilities may be thwarted, diverted, even retroactively undone. There can be a tragedy of non-realization and derealization. But revolution also redefines what counts as possible and what appears, that is to say, what is officially mandated to be impossible. Revolutions show that history has its poetry. They show history to be an archive of possibilities rather than a storehouse of facts. In exposing history to its own latency, revolution is the prime example of mediated immediacy. A revolution is a special kind, one of a kind of one. Its singularity makes it repeat. Revolutionary action is an exemplary action. It represents itself as action. It redefines the terms of action. It is a cue for action. Revolution is the pivot between the act and its own recapitulation or rephrasing. Or put simply, as in Marxist lingo, the revolution is never sans phrase. Collective action needs signposts. History needs captions. This is the function of the revolutionary slogan, a topic that so preoccupied Lenin that he would actually take time out in the summer of 1917, a funny time to be doing this, to write an essay on the language of slogans, why he kept issuing directives on the correct phrasing and timing, adjusting their cadences, to the shifting gusts of politics, issuing each with a precise release date and withdrawing it from circulation the moment its time expired. A slogan is a pure performative. It makes history in marking it. A revolution is itself a kind of slogan. It abridges, it repeats, it circulates. Revolution condenses history. It marks the point where the totality flashes into view in the crystalline moment of action. Revolution is where history as a whole insists. Possibility surges into visibility when the organic fabric of history rips. Revolutions show that possibility is not a lump of positivity, not a potentiality awaiting actualization, a bouquet of utopian promises, a rainbow of regulative ideas, or the receding horizon of an infinite task, the endlessly deferred possibility, which is the paralyzing impossibility of what Kant called the ought, or Sollen. You ought to, meaning you never actually will. They demonstrate why possibility isn't a given, but a result. It's a historical artifact rather than a natural capacity. Despite and because of their immediacy, revolutionary possibilities require mediation. They must survive and traverse a bristle of obstacles and contingencies to become what they are. That is, possibilities. They are retroactively activated, but this can also mean disabled by what they enable. And this is why revolutions come into such sharp focus from the perspective of their lapsing. It's as a missed or expired possibility, even an impossibility, that a revolution makes its most urgent claims. And I don't mean by this to fetishize failure, not at all, but simply to question the self-evidence of success as the measure of revolutionary achievement. Freedom isn't a possession or acquisition that accretes temporally from generation to generation, or expands geographically from center to periphery. It's not a good that can be hoarded, distributed, divided, or bequeathed. Failure, not success, may be the motor and method of revolutionary succession. And that's why every revolutionary interregnum is so fraught, as Hannah Arendt noted, but for the wrong reasons. She was thinking about the succession crises following the deaths of Lenin and Stalin, which she attributed to the specific pathologies of totalitarianism. But we don't need to go there or to subscribe to that dubious framework to see the problem. A revolution throws the dynastic order of transmission and transition into disarray. So it's not out of some kind of cosmic or Sisyphean futility that revolutions keep repeating, that they stall and judder, constantly short-circuiting and lurching back to their starting point to start up all over again. There's a reason for this retroversion, namely that history can't wait. Paradoxically, it's impatience and not nostalgia that turns the clock back. Revolutions don't advance by steps and stages, each picking up where the previous one left off. History doesn't progress, it doesn't accumulate, it doesn't wait. Every aborted revolution undermines the achievements of the preceding revolutions and the heroic narratives inspired by these. And the danger ripples backwards until the entire past is shattered by its power. It's in this sense that Benjamin will describe revolution as an emergency brake. forcing the locomotive of progress to a halt. But time doesn't stand still in the revolutionary standstill. The shock introduces a reverse thrust into history, forcing a return back to the beginning, where everything must start anew. The entire past must be smashed to rubble. Everything must start again, including the original beginning, which loses its foundational authority and ceases to be the beginning. The return to ground zero forces a complete reconfiguration of the political imaginary. It demands nothing less than a total reworking of the world. This is a melancholic, even a pessimistic finding. We are confronted with the death drive in action, but not a defeatist one. Pessimism must be organized. A phrase from Benjamin. In short, history has its tragic side. People make history, but not as they please. History is something made, a facture, a fabrication, a fiction. But this is a productivity of a curiously inhibited kind. History is neither a storehouse of raw material nor a trove of inspiring examples. It's a rubble heap of broken off initiatives that both goad and hinder our agency with the pressure of unfinished business. We keep falling on snippets of interrupted performances from the past that impinge with the haunting insistence of half-forgotten melodies. History is this stumbling. Praxis is parapraxis. That revolutions repeat, that the drama keeps replaying, shows something involuntary and even mechanical, undignified, inhuman, even non-living at the core of human life. You can call this the death drive if you want, but this is also Bergson's definition of the comic, which has nothing to do with happy outcomes and is neither fun or even funny. We convulse with laughter, our own bodies becoming rigid and machine-like when we catch sight of the deadness encrusting or interrupting the flow of life. So we're back again in the territory of the 18th Brumaire. The workers' defeat at the hands of the supposed allies had detonated a cascade of retroactive defeats that stretched back to the beginnings of the revolutionary epoch. The disaster of June 1848, you know what happened, everybody was massacred. Okay. The ugly, what Marx calls the ugly revolution, proved to be neither an isolated accident nor a deviation from the glory days of 1789. The bloodbath spilled backward. It stained the beautiful revolution of February that year, the revolution of universal sympathy, when bourgeois and proletariats had joined forces under the Republican banner. It would stain the July Revolution of 1830, already tainted by the mediocrity of its outcome. And the stain would keep seeping backward until it tarnished the foundational aspirations of 1789. It was no longer possible to represent the French Revolution as an unfinished or half-finished project, a promise awaiting fulfillment, the first act of a two-act drama. That had been Marx's original wager. First, the revolution, the political revolution, then the other revolution, the social revolution, the revolution within revolution, repetition as redemption. The June debacle demonstrated that the revolutionary mantle cannot pass simply or directly from bourgeoisie to proletariat. The problem with the Republican Revolution was not that it failed to measure up to its concept, that its universalism was truncated, but rather that the concept itself was barren or bankrupt. 1848 exposed the essential illiberalism at the heart of the democratic liberal order. This would be confirmed by Bonaparte's landslide electoral success in the aftermath of the June massacre and his effortless coup d'etat 3 years later. So that's democracy in action. In 1848, the Great French Revolution dropped its aura. It wasn't that the legacy was usurped or squandered, that the copy didn't live up to the original. The declension from genius to idiot, from uncle to nephew, turned the hero into a fool, the ancestor into a pretender. It wasn't that little Bonaparte couldn't fill his uncle's shoes, but that his uncle couldn't fill them either. Like many an uncle before him, Creon, Claudius, perhaps even the great Caesar himself, who was an uncle. He was Augustus's uncle. It's all sort of uncles and nephews here. The uncle was already a usurper. Napoleon, the real one, Napoleon I, had compared the completion of the revolution to the conclusion of a novel. The revolution is concluded, finalized, fulfilled. La révolution, c'est fini. It's done, finished. The events of 1848 unwrote the final chapter, turning the uncle's boast inside out. C'est fini. The revolution is canceled, liquidated, done in. The ambiguity of this endedness, completion, termination, allowed Louis Bonaparte, the nephew, to ride his uncle's coattails in opposite directions at once. Revolution and counter-revolution rolled into a single discordant extravaganza and enabled his overwhelming electoral and later plebiscitary success. The tragedy of 1848 turned 1789 into a farce. This is tragic. Why farce? A repeat performance, a travesty, a diabolical inversion, counter-revolution, masquerading in the faded insignia of the revolution. The travesty will reach its pitch when Louis Bonaparte, nephew, assumes his uncle's name and nominates himself Emperor Napoleon III on December 2nd, 1852, the anniversary of his uncle's self-coronation on December 2nd, 1804, and the one-year anniversary of the nephew's coup on December 2nd, 1851. There's a lot of anniversaries here. Farce may not fully capture the cocktail of populism and authoritarianism, buffoonery and violence that reached its peak in the Second Empire. Mocking Hegel, Marx describes this tumultuous scene as an endless twilight, gray on gray, where despite and because of all the fireworks, nothing happens and everything stays the same. I think we're on the first quote of your handout here. First. Passion without truth, truth without passion, heroes without exploits, history without events, developments driven solely by the calendar and wearisome through constant repetition of the same tension and release. Tension and release, stretch and sag, push and pull. This is how you put on a counter-revolution. You've just heard the reference to Hegel's gray on gray, which is how he described the twilight of philosophy, looking back at a history it cannot change, but only understand. And it's funny to find Revolution 2.0 soaked in the monochromatic hues of reaction. But Marx's repetition of Hegel goes beyond citation and allusion. It operates at an inconspicuous formal level of grammar and syntax. I just want to pause on this briefly because I think form is never a merely formal matter. It gives expression to a real material impasse. And for my purposes today, two well-known examples will suffice. And I'm going to be looking at the second and the third items on your handout for the next little while. The first is flamboyantly, even hyperbolically dialectical. I'll read them out loud so you don't have to mess around now. So the first one, number 2, is flamboyantly, hyperbolically dialectical. The second, brazenly undialectical. And in good dialectical fashion, they form a pair. The first is a passage from toward the end of the 18th Brumaire. Marx is describing the comeuppance of a class that has tossed away systematically every single one of its political gains to protect its economic assets. Knowing instinctively that it must forfeit the crown to save its purse, it must be prepared to relinquish democracy to safeguard its property. The bourgeoisie rehearses its exit from the political arena. So here we have passage number 2, the first passage, and if you can just kind of, well, it's not hard to follow because it's kind of right in your face. There's all these reversals that are going on. It deified the sword. Now the sword rules over it. It destroyed the revolutionary press. Now its own press is destroyed. It put public meetings under police surveillance. Now its own salons are under police surveillance. It dismantled the Democratic National Guard. Now its own National Guard has been disbanded. It imposed a state of siege. Now a state of siege has been imposed upon it. It supplanted juries with military commissions. Now its own juries have been supplanted by military commissions. And so on. It continues, actually. It keeps on continuing. It continues with such kind of mechanical insistence that it kind of either puts you to sleep or it really wakes you up. And what's happening here? Like how much can you keep doing this? As history grinds to a halt, the dialectic stutters. Everything is reversing. Everything is turning around, and yet nothing is happening. Marx's syntax is as staccato as a machine gun, the dialectical machinery at its most unstoppable. There's almost too much dialectic, circle upon circle, and yet the wheels just spin. The gears don't catch. The locomotive won't budge. Too much tragedy, and no tragedy at all. The cascade of inversions harbors just the faintest echo of, what Aristotle calls peripete, or the sort of tragic reversal where fortunes, end up going the opposite way that they started. And herein lies the farce. The bourgeoisie's reversals of fortune are unaccompanied by any kind of self-recognition and yield no moral uplift. Distracted from its historical assignment and blind to the significance of its concessions, the bourgeoisie is incapable of recognizing the stakes of its own downfall and cannot claim the role of tragic hero. Parliamentary cretinism, as Marx unaffectionately calls it, expresses the ignorance specific to the liberal democratic form, but this blindness also harbors a canny insight, namely that to maintain its monopoly on power, the bourgeoisie must dismantle this power. It would rather submit to total executive power than open the tiniest foothold to the working class. Marx describes the parliamentary implosion. So what happened is basically by democratic means, within, following parliamentary procedure, the bourgeoisie just decided to just give away one privilege after one democratic, mandate after another until basically they were off, they're out of play. He describes the parliamentary implosion as a fizzle and fade out. These are his words, not a blow up. As for poofed, he says. Their history has ceased forever, and yet they linger. Long after its political demise, the bourgeoisie keeps coming back to replay the non-event of its own defeat. Decrepit, impotent, I'm paraphrasing Marx, who says it much more floridly, defunct before it has reached maturity, the bourgeoisie keeps returning to the stage as if it hadn't noticed that its hour was over. Like Kafka's Hunter Gracchus, it has missed the moment of its own death. It has prepared its last will and testament, but having failed to name or acknowledge its successor, it lives on past its expiration date, if only to testify to its own demise. There's almost a Beckett-like slapstick in this perseveration, as Marx describes it, certainly. And I think it would take a kind of King Lear figure to transform the indignities of senescence into a grand tragedy of overliving. And this accords well with the gray on gray of the decor. The problem is not exactly useless or unemployed negativity in the sense of an untrammeled excess beyond the clutches of the dialectic. It's not that the machine isn't working, but rather that it's working all too well. It's in overdrive and caught in a frenzy of overproduction. In its prodigious hyper-efficiency, the dialectic, that is to say history itself, has become threadbare and formulaic. It keeps generating climaxes that turn out to be anticlimaxes, reversals that are empty inversions, contradictions that keep collapsing into the wooden binaries of the understanding. Antagonisms, I'm quoting Marx here, antagonisms that seem to work up to a climax only to lose their sharpness and fall away without resolution. So it's kind of pseudo-crisis upon crisis, sort of things come to a pitch and then nothing happens. That's not the way contradiction is supposed to work in a dialectical universe. Something's supposed to happen. The crisis is only formally a crisis. It fails to detonate the antagonism that would catalyze a real social transformation. That antagonism can only be a class antagonism, and that's precisely what isn't happening here. A turbulence that forestalls revolutionary rupture, or what Marx says, insurrection within the limits of reason alone. Nice Kantian joke here. Dialectical contradiction has collapsed into the churnings of antinomies that go nowhere, generate nothing, function only negatively to place a brake on reason and to protect the world from reason's onslaught. The catastrophe is that there is no catastrophe. The state of emergency has become the norm. Dialectical stammer is the dialect of the state of siege. It's not simply that the machine is jamming or spewing out globs of inassimilable heterogeneity, as some Bataille-inspired readers of the 18th Brumaire have argued. These readings are usually inspired by Marx's really unfortunate diatribe against the scum, awful, O-F-F-A-L, awful refuse of all classes, that swarm of disjecta that keeps coagulating into a force of reaction. The class that is no class, leaking across class boundaries and threatening to erode the integrity and agency of the once universal class. Workers who are not working, unemployed or unemployable, not yet or no longer integrated within the productive economy, pushed into the shadow economy or into the criminal underworld, historical and geographical migrants caught in the temporal interregnum between feudal past and capitalist present, and in the spatial limbo or geographical limbo between town and country, forced off the land but unassimilated into the city, ejected or excluded from the proletariat while hollowing it out from within and bubbling to the surface as scum, Marx's word, lumpen proletariat. Marx's exuberantly, and it must be said, racist description of what he calls this passively rotting mass has been deplored and admired in equal measure. It scandalizes for obvious reasons. But the passage is also appreciated as a virtuosic set piece of wild or undialectical heterogeneity. So the famous sentence, probably one of the most famous sentences in this text, which is full of quotables. I mean, it has more kind of, it's like reading, encountering to be or not to be, like all these things from text that you sort of know. So I'm looking at quote number 3 here. This is the sentence just kind of pops off the page. I'm going to read it out loud. Alongside decayed roué with dubious means of subsistence and of dubious origin, alongside ruined and adventurous offshoots of the bourgeoisie, were vagabonds, discharged soldiers, discharged convicts, escaped galley slaves, swindlers, charlatans, lazzaroni. Lazzaroni are the kind of mob people from Naples. Pickpockets, tricksters, gamblers, who may be actors, actually, the word is the same. Maquereaux, which means brothel keepers, porters, literati, organ grinders, rag pickers, knife grinders, tinkers, beggars. In short, he says, summarizing, the whole indefinite disintegrated mass thrown hither and thither, which the French call la bohème. We can maybe return, later, afterwards, to the formal aspect of this congeries, noting only that the lumpen prefix is an empty or vagabond signifier that eventually attaches to all classes: proletariat, peasants, bourgeoisie, aristocrats, Louis Bonaparte himself, chief of the lumpen proletariat, ruining classification and the idea of class itself. For the rod extends from the Parisian underbelly to the swindlers at the top of the food chain, the stock jobbers, landlords, financiers, in whose unembellished corruption we witness the birth of the lumpen proletariat on the most prominent stages of bourgeois society. I was quoting Marx here. What connects these social extremes is the penumbra of unproductive labor that sustains and shadows the industrial economy at both its edges. This includes not only the service economy in the downmarket sense, sex workers, knife grinders, organ players, but the parasites at the top of the food chain, whose sources of profit are drawn not directly or from the abstract but finite labor time of commodity production, but from the seemingly inexhaustible extraction time of rent, interest, and speculation. It's impossible to identify a single feature uniting this motley group, and that's the point. The lumpen are the epitome of a community that has nothing in common. They are the force of disaggregation incarnate. What they share is a disaffiliation from every existing communal bond. Marx's exaggerated parataxis, that in this sentence there's not even a copula, there's not even a verb here, it's just literally just a bunch of nouns. His exaggerated parataxis captures the systematic attack on linking that defines the asocial sociability of this motley crowd. But in their disconnection lies their indissoluble connection. In this respect, the lumpen are the exception that is the rule. While excluded from all the privileges of civil society, they epitomize the atomism that defines the society. They embody the centrifugal force of the money they lack. And that's why they're so easily absorbed into the counter-revolution, recruited to the military, cajoled into Bonaparte's coterie, or by whoever pays the price. But what are all these people doing on the stage, and where is everybody else? As the word suggests, farce is the overstuffed genre that stretches to contain multitudes. Hence the multiplication of actors, accompanied by a shrinking of good speaking parts, and by the bombast of a player king stupid enough to take his comedy for world history. The pageant explodes into a carnival of minor characters, while the real historical actors are swept off stage. Removed from visibility, massacred, deported, incarcerated, pacified, ejected from the city center by the forces of gentrification, the workers have retreated to a shadowy offstage arena. The revolutionary subject of history no longer appears in person or as a collective personality. It's no longer the bourgeoisie, which has regressed from its glory days and quivers before its own revolutionary past. It's not, or not yet, the proletariat, which has retreated to a murky offstage existence. It's not, or not yet, the peasants, which at that time were some 80% of the French population, who are mired in nostalgic imperial reveries while buried under an avalanche of taxes. Monads, sans pre-existing harmony, literally windowless in their hovels, as disaggregated as a sack of potatoes. That's Marx's metaphor. And Marx has notoriously abandoned hope in the ragged multitude as a force of insurrection. So where's the revolution? Marx declines to give a name to this obscure revolutionary agency, opting for simply the revolution, or maybe just revolution as personified agent of history. Personification may not quite capture an agency that's straining the categories of the human. It turns out to be a small, hungry animal that's doing all the work. And work may not quite describe this creature's blind, voracious, seemingly aimless, destructive toil. So here's another famous passage. Number 4. But the revolution is thorough. The word, the German word is Grundlich, which also just has to do with the ground. So it's kind of to do with, if you want to go there, it's actually earthy. It's still on its journey through purgatory. It goes about its business methodically. First, it developed parliamentary power in order to be able to overthrow it. Now that it's achieved this, it's developing the executive power, reducing it to its purest expression, isolating it, confronting it as its sole antagonist in order to concentrate all its powers of destruction against it. And when it has completed the second half of its preparatory work, Europe will jump up and cry out, "Well grubbed, old mole." This is from Hamlet via Hegel to Marx. With the hypertrophy of executive power, so he's talking about a dictatorship, counter-revolution condenses into a single unified opponent against which the revolution can and must rally its forces. Marx embraces the coup for its unvarnished display of power. The tragic binary reasserts itself in the decisive standoff between two clearly opposed antagonists, a simplification, a clarification, a cathartic purification of the class struggle, just where it seemed most uncertain and diffuse. Where negativity keeps dissolving into a fog of disaggregated differences, Marx retrieves antagonism at the point of its greatest attenuation. The impediment to revolution turns out to be its enabling condition. I'm kind of slowly winding up here. In his 1885 postface, afterward, to the third edition of the 18th Brumaire, Engels praises Marx's ability to parry the slings and arrows of revolutionary misfortune. Nothing surprised Marx, he said. It turns out that the excrescences that had been sabotaging the machinery of revolution were all this time oiling it. The forces that had been corroding class integrity proved to be agents of class unification. Even the superannuated bourgeoisie turned out to have been working over time in the service of the revolution. In capitulating to state power, they cast a spotlight on its omnipresent violence. This is the cunning of reason at its most cunning. The corpses of the insurgents, of the June insurgents, can be finally thrown on the slaughter bench of history as collateral damage. The impediment to revolution turns out to be its enabling condition. But who or what then is the revolution, and why personify? The abstract opaqueness, or the opaque abstractness of this noun mirrors the motley concreteness, which is just another form of abstractness, of the teeming lumpen. But the abstraction is a real one. The disconnect is materially generated and, like all abstractions, is experienced at a palpable bodily level. It registers the difficulties of locating political agency in a world where the terms of action are constantly changing. The challenges are practical, tactical, organizational, but they're also epistemological and representational or aesthetic. They pertain to the changing velocities and scalar slippages of the revolutionary theater. What is a revolution? When is a revolution? What are its ends and limits? How do you know it when you see it? Where does it go when its players are dispersed, exiled, massacred, or driven underground? What is the difference between an interruption and a termination, between fatigue and exhaustion, between failure and defeat? How long can an intermission last before it ceases to be an intermission? What happens when the stage gets too empty or too crowded, when there are either too many players, this is a problem that had been rehearsed by Euripides back in the day, or not enough, something that will be explored by Beckett? How do you represent a collective protagonist? What is revolution in the absence of a clearly defined revolutionary class? This is less, I think, the structural causality of a sort of Althusserian process without a subject than a process in search of a subject that is generated in and by the search itself. There is no class consciousness, and therefore no class prior to or outside the class struggle. Character is subordinate to plot. Marx pushes Aristotle's poetics. So for Aristotle, it was all plot, and character was just a function of plot. The characters were just the things that got the plot mobilized. Yeah, so it's all plot. Character is subordinate to plot. Marx pushes Aristotle's poetics to its Nietzschean extreme. There is no doer behind the deed. The agent of revolution is the revolution, or maybe simply revolution. This is not the first time or the last time that the revolution has assumed the corporate dignity of a quasi-person. It acquired its majuscule as soon as it was registered as a revolution in the first place, when the multiple upheavals erupting simultaneously and spontaneously across France over the summer of 1789 coalesced into a singular event, a revolution, turning rapidly into the revolution, the one and only, unprecedented, unrepeatable, and for that reason, perpetually renascent. The sort of fount of subsequent revolutions, the charismatic object of transference in an unending tragedy of succession, betrayal, usurpation, displacement. Revolution is the ultimate lost object. For Hegel, and now we're at the final passage on your sheet, the old mole was a providential figure of reason and history, spirit's inexorable movement towards the daylight, tunneling ever onward and upward. In his final lecture of his course on the history of philosophy, reviewing the seemingly aimless, but as it turns out, purposeful itinerary of spirits burrowing through the centuries, Hegel recalls Hamlet's jocular words to his father's ghost, who's been moving around erratically beneath the stage floor. Well done, old mole. Spirit congratulates itself for having reached the finish line on time to complete its most serious labor. So Hegel's formula here is world history is the world's court of judgment, and Judgment Day always arrives on time. As in the ancient Roman law courts, where lacking electricity, the proceedings had to be concluded by nightfall. You had to have a judgment by the time the sun set. It's a nice way of just keeping it simple. The verdict of history is delivered as dusk is falling. As Hegel's mole makes his breakthrough to modernity, it breaks ground not from above, that is to say, not in Cartesian fashion by making a clean sweep or tabula rasa of history, but rather from below. In breaking through the sedimented crust of history, it leaves behind the rubble of an ossified tradition. As it emerges from the wreckage, the old mole straps on the magic boots that will catapult it over the epochs of world history in a single leap. Before bidding his students farewell, Hegel offers a breathtakingly abridged summary of the entire history of philosophy, or what counts as that, European philosophy, crammed into a few short pages. Hegel's mole is thus the opposite of Benjamin's angel of history, where the angel wants to make whole what has been smashed, wants to repair, but sees only an accumulating pile of rubble. The mole, magically metamorphosed into the owl of Minerva, has encyclopedic hindsight. It was a perverse but inspired choice of animals on Hegel's part. Perverse, if only because sunlight is what a normal mole avoids most. Nocturnal and light-shy, a mole has an unlimited capacity for underground existence. It literally doesn't have to ever come up, ever. And every reason to avoid surfacing. Yet there's something oddly fitting about the metaphor. I mean, fitting in a Hegel universe. The mole's appetite is endless, and its powers of assimilation prodigious. It consumes up to half its body weight each day in worms. And in a parody of spirit's capacity to self-metabolize, to make its exterior its own interior, the mole is also endowed with a special kind of hemoglobin that enables it to breathe its own carbon dioxide. It literally inhales its own exhalation beyond the limits of animal endurance, and is thus uniquely poised to survive the longue durée of a history that would be suffocating for any other living being. It was Marx who turned the old mole into one of the buzziest of all buzzwords. And in the 18th Brumaire, it probably comes second only to the tragedy farce meme for quotability, and in a text bursting with bon mots that sang a lot. Smelling a Hegelian rat, Deleuze and Guattari, and later Hart Negri, will reject the bouncy optimism of the figure, its old-fashioned teleology, the outmoded topography of depth and surface, proposing instead the snake as a more suitable insurrectionary agent in a world of global flow and connectivity, where everything is slithering on the surface in a horizontal rhizomatic network. Not to be outdone, Zizek proposes the kraken, a giant squid, as more appropriate for the eruptive intensity of revolution, now retrofitted as the monstrous obscenity of the real. I rummaged around in the bestiary for a while to see if I could come up with something better, but I think I'll stick with the figure of the old mole for now, not least in homage to the subterranean passageways and tunnels of the Palestinian resistance, and because it captures the obstinacy, the intermittencies, the latencies, the intrusive absences, for disappearance can be as much a tactic as a practical necessity, but also the thundering explosions that, to a disengaged onlooker, or to those with a vested interest in barbarity, might appear random, irrational, extravagant, sensational, and ultimately as entertaining as a monster erupting from the deep in a Hollywood horror show. Sorry, Zizek. People have a vested interest in seeing it that way. But there's something compelling in the stubbornness of the dig, the push and pull of soil back and forth, pulsating, erratic. But also there's the hypervigilance of a creature endowed with an uncanny, seemingly extrasensory intelligence, vibratory, tactile. We can also surely acknowledge here the force of fantasy and the drive. Revolution moves at different velocities above and below ground. There's a difference between the deep geological time of the unconscious and the rapid time of organization, where pacing and timing are all. It's the old mole who undertakes the repetitive, often tedious, but never routine or habitual. The long, slow movement, I'm quoting here from Rosa Luxemburg, the long, slow movement, itself patient of impatience. As Rosa Luxemburg wrote just a few days before her murder in Berlin in 1919, when order reigned in Berlin. This is the title of the tract, Order Reigns in Berlin. And the echoes of the slaughtered communards in the streets of Paris 3 decades later, earlier, resounded in the streets of Berlin, Warsaw, and beyond. Analogy. The Hamlet reference is also useful. I think. It underscores the spectral power of the command, the oath, the testamentary injunction. And it is crucial here that the old mole, that is, the father's ghost moving beneath the stage floor in the first act of Hamlet, is no longer a sovereign authority asserting a power reserved for kings and patriarchs, but a dethroned king, a debased, humiliated, or at least humbled father, certainly an earthy one, passing on a legacy that is not his own to bequeath. The line of descent is uncertain, broken, unfixed. That what Benjamin will call the tradition of the oppressed is not a dynasty. The revolutionary heritage, that is freedom, is not a property or possession. Okay, I'm just about to stop. When Hamlet's father makes his next and final entry, another surprise appearance, this time in Gertrude's chamber in the third act, he appears even less as a king in shining armor, but shabbily attired in humble night clothes. Maybe he's just woken up. Noting his father's plebeian appearance, Hamlet calls him a king of shreds and patches, or in Schlegel's translation of Hamlet, which Marx would surely have been reading, he calls him a Lumpenkönig, a lumpen king. But that would open up a whole new direction. So I think I'm going to stop here. Thanks. Yeah.
Just kind of get something started here, but yeah, thanks for all that. I mean, there's a lot to take in, but maybe I suppose a question about the kind of the move from Marx to Hegel and from Hegel to Marx, and in the sense that are we saying, yeah, maybe say a bit more about the because you said at the beginning I will kind of stay with Marx here. Maybe just kind of the lumpen in Marx. I mean, at least from the quote here, and you know, it's very interesting to put it this way in the sense that we always thought of the lumpen in terms of somehow as in related to a class. Yet not, you know, not certainly a class, and somehow I think this is really interesting to think about it across as kind of this kind of excess, and from the useless speculator to the kind of to the beggar and the rag picker. And I guess the question, if we were to stay with Marx on that, how does it work with Hegel's I don't know. I don't want to talk. I don't want to bring in the rabble and all this other stuff. Maybe just something on this that would. Yeah.
I mean, I think what I'm trying to talk about. So I mean, there's. So Marx and Engels on the lumpen proletariat are terrible. I mean, I don't think there's anything to. I mean, they're just. It's manifestly reeking with class racism and racism, and it's a few, it's just associated with all, it's connected to all kinds of other things they're doing with respect to Ireland and Naples and wherever else they can, wherever else they just don't understand. And there's obviously ways in which, partly in reaction to that, but also for independent reasons, from Fanon onwards, the category of the lumpen has actually been taken to be the locus of revolutionary agency, but the reason I call this lumpen dialectic is not because I'm thinking about how Hegel on poverty connects to Marx on sort of the dispossessed, but the way in which I think for Marx, particularly in this text, contradiction is put into crisis. Class antagonism is put into crisis. The loss of, the seeming evisceration of a class binary has been, has kind of dissolved. So where do you, if you don't have class antagonism, then how do you have revolution? And, where is the contradiction? You just seem to this, the sort of question of class composition is kind of going insane. There's no class unity whatsoever, and for this, the lumpen proletariat is to blame. Okay. So there's that. So this is the crisis of the crisis of the class. This is the crisis of class struggle. Is also the crisis of tragedy, which is a fundamentally binary form, and is the crisis of the dialectic, which cannot proceed but by means of contradiction, which has to work by simplification. And so one of the puzzles of one reason why I brought out that funny passage where everything was flipping around like crazy, is because you kind of have this ghost, this shell of contradiction, some kind of binary with something flipping this and that, and X and non-X, and but it's kind of out of work. I mean, the dialectic itself has become lumpen in the sense that it's become a leftover of itself, and that's the problem that it's not a scholarly thing about Hegel at all. It's a thing about it's a thing about contradiction. I mean, can you think of history in a non-contradictory way? Can you think of contradiction in a non-teleological way? I mean, something is breaking with something in Marx is breaking with a teleological model of progress through binary antagonism in a way that he's not yet found a way to articulate what actually will enable change or will necessitate change. So the old mole is kind of a stopgap. I mean, it's vindicating, revolutionary agency in the absence of, any determinate locus of antagonism. And so that would be the basic movement that I'm trying to think about here. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I think that helps a lot. I'll take a few questions. We'll start with Jennifer and then Lisa.
Thank you. That was such a rich talk. There's so much to think about. So this is sort of preliminary first question, which is about analogy, the shift from the moment when you were talking about analogy to the discussion of revolution. I'm not sure if you were thinking of these revolutionary echoes as analogy, but to me it seems like there's a tighter connection between 1789 and 1848 and the kind of self-referential nature of revolutionary action. Whereas I would have thought of analogy as drawing connections to things that you don't expect to be connected, or that seem on the face of it dissimilar, or as you said at one point in your beautiful discussion of analogy, things that would otherwise be disparate, and it's kind of exercise of analogy, analogizing things together. So I guess it's a question about how you think about the relationship between analogy versus exemplarity or prefiguration.
Do you want to take a few, and then, or do you want to?
A tiny question about the old role, which is just the fact that Hamlet's father has been buried seems relevant. Like, is it something that seemed inert and interred has become alive and is moving underground in that way? Is that important, and is there a way to think about that?
Yeah, the underground is also where that people go. Yeah, for sure. And where revolution got buried. Yeah.
So how do you want to do it? Do you want to answer each one? We have 4 questions from the floor till now. Do you want to do one by one?
Sure.
You prefer that?
Maybe.
Okay.
Yeah. So analogy. Yes. So there's. So analogy is very double-edged. It's the first thing that can be commandeered by the rulers. I mean, it's the first thing that can be controlled, dictated, mandated, forbidden, as we can see right now. Yeah. And so, in that sense, but that to me is also an indication of the kind of subversive potential of analogy. I mean, that it has to be so controlled. So yes, it's finding something unexpected, making an association, finding a kinship, which is not granted, which is not kind of patriarchal in essence, but for sure. But it's also wresting similarity. From the hands of those who impose identities. So yeah, 1848 is a conscious recapitulation, in some sense, of the French Revolution, which continues to hold its tyrannical grip on revolution period, which is absurd. But I would say that analogy doesn't have to just be unexpected to be surprising or motivating or mobilizing. So sometimes the unsurprising can become surprising. And similarity can be stifled as becoming identity, but identity itself can be. Can become similar. So I don't think it's a one or the other, which is why analogy is a fight. One has to fight for it.
Lisa?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. That was an amazing talk, very beautiful, and there's so much to think with and about. And I guess I'm going to follow up on both of Jennifer's questions there. The first one about analogy and your initial response to that. Because it seems to me that even though analogy can be the site of a certain kind of, certainly struggle, but also you were suggesting earlier, capture, it strikes me as also it is something where there's a lot of way in which regimes of one sort, I'm thinking Trump, he uses analogy all the time. So there are certain kinds of analogy, it seems, that are dangerous to evoke.
Absolutely,
like
which is why
genocide.
it's a fight. Yeah,
You know?
you have to
But
fight,
but there
right.
are other kinds of analogies, like, you know, him a superhero, or the way in which AI, he's been able to galvanize AI for his own parodic deployments. And I just wondered if you could say a little bit more about, I mean, you asked at one point, how can we tell when something's a revolution? How can we tell when, I mean, a number of beautiful questions that you asked at one point. I think I'm going to go back. How do you know a revolution when you see it? What is the difference between fatigue and exhaustion, between failure and defeat? What happens when the stage gets too empty or too crowded? Those are your words. And I guess I wanted to ask you about analogy in that way. When does analogy become something that enables a certain kind of counter-revolutionary squelching of potential, and when does it, allow for the kind of creativity and revolutionary struggle that most of us in this room would like to rejuvenate? So that's my first question. Maybe you could take that one, and then I'll ask the second one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's any empirical labels.
Yeah.
You know, that doesn't wear its, you know, on its shirt. You don't. It's nothing in the content of the analogy itself, which is going to announce whether it's pernicious, repressive, oppressive, stabilizing, exclusionary, and so on, like proprietary. We get this analogy, you know, this is ours. And we can, I mean, obviously it's such a hot thing right now, right? So so it is how it's being mobilized, which is why it's a fight. Like it's in the fight itself, not in which analogy or what the terms are, or something like that. It's just it's actually how it's being mobilized, what it's being used for, what it's being used against.
Yeah, I was thinking also, though, of conditions of possibility that might make certain kinds of, I mean, I don't know, but I was just thinking about this in the context of the talk. Are there certain kinds of analogies, maybe, I don't know, that are more amenable to struggle than others? And maybe that's not an answer one can, you know, give in the abstract or...
Well, this is, I mean, we're talking at a fairly abstract level, but I mean, I think the denial of analogy.
The prohibition on analogy.
The prohibition, I mean, sort of, okay, I mean, obviously the point that we're all thinking about is the singularity, the incomparability of the Holocaust. Like, you can't analogize because, you know, it's sui generis. And, I mean, that proscription on analogy, we just see it, you know.
Yeah.
Which is an indication that analogy actually is a dangerous thing.
Yeah. Thank you. The other question I had was about the old mole. So to follow up on, and thinking about that in relationship to the first time as tragedy, the second time as farce, where Marx is claiming that Hegel once said somewhere that, but of course Hegel didn't say that anywhere. So I wondered whether you could say a little bit more about whether Marx is positioning himself as the mole that's going underground, as somebody who is himself playing with the dialectical relationship between tragedy and farce, and as a revolutionary then has to get embedded in the earth once again, to go underground in the context of what looks like at least at the moment, of a failure that will require action for rejuvenation.
So, yeah, Hegel never said that, and so therefore wouldn't have been able to forget it because he never said it anyway.
I mean, there's something very funny and farcical about
Hegel
that.
Hegel says something about repetition, historical repetition, ratifying. You know it must be real because it happened twice. If it happened twice, it had to happen. Like that sort of imposes a retroactive necessity on what happened. Yeah, so why does he invoke, what's your question though? Why does he invoke Hegelian?
Why does he invoke that in the context of thinking about farce, and where we have this understanding where Hegel does talk about the mole, which is also talking about Shakespeare's Hamlet's mole, where it seems to me that Marx is positioning himself perhaps also in the farcical, but also as the mole that needs to go underground. That if we take those two things together, I don't know, there might be something there, just something that occurred to me in your talk.
Right, and so the way, the kind of ungenerous ways of reading Marx's Old Mole, like as in these guys I was just kind of referring to, would be that, yeah, it's just bad, vulgar Hegelian theodicy, teleology, like everything's going to turn out okay because,
Oh, but I think of it as
so,
like a generous reading in the sense that he's playing with it.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. The ungenerous readings of Marx, of Marx's mobilization of that Hamletian Hegelian trope would be that, yes, Marx is just a bad Hegelian. He's just, it's all about things coming out good in the wash at the end of the day. And it's obviously certainly possible, not very interesting to read it that way, but no, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, there's something in the, in the pressure, but also the opacity of making revolution a placeholder, which is not really a personification or a hypothesization of just revolution as if it was a person. It really is acknowledging this gap that this kind of, we don't know. Actually, revolution is obviously not per se an agent, but it does say that, in the absence of, you don't know the agent, there's no pre-existent agent of revolution. The agent, the classes or whatever are formed in the revolution itself. And that, to me, is the beauty of that pseudo-personification, is it desubstantializes, defetishizes, any collective agency that could be identified outside or before these struggle.
That might have to do with, I think we have two questions there, Ozren and Ray. What did you?
Let me try to phrase it in a technical sense. What is it that writes the Lumpen dialectic? And where is the Lumpen dialectic written and enacted? I'm consciously avoiding the question of who is it that writes the Lumpen dialectic, because if I think about possibility, I think about logic and I think about the subject. And in terms of the opposition that you introduced between an Althusserian process without a subject and a process in search of a subject, Althusser himself referred to Hegel famously as a thinker of a process which is in itself its own subject. Now, if we start with possibility and with modality and thus with logic, do we not fall back always into a certain Hegelian understanding of the dialectic? Whereas the question of what is it that writes the Lumpen dialectic is always answered in the sense of it is philosophy itself. And where is it written? It is written in the sites of the philosophical articulation. So let's say in the site of the system as such. And in Marx, do we not have a different movement in Marx? A different movement which is precisely, in my view, the correct way to read your phrasing, a process in search of a subject, which precisely means a process unable to grasp the subject, a concept encountering a subject which always exceeds it, which is the way in which I would read Marx's own encounter with the political real of the workers' struggles in the middle of the 19th century. The incessant shifts of terrain that he himself takes, the incessant movements, the slippage of the terrain, the impossibility of rendering the dialectic consistent, the movement, the shift from philosophy to social theory. the shift from different objects of critique of philosophy, critique of religion, critique of politics, critique of political economy. So precisely the inability to capture within the concept to capture the subject, to capture a certain political real which incessantly escapes it. Is this a way to? Are we dealing? How do we relate back to Marx? Do we relate back to Marx by attempting to follow something inherent or immanent in Marx, or do we need Hegel to come back to Marx? Is possibility, in this sense, the category through which, and thus is logic the category through which we should go back to the middle of the 19th century?
So to be honest, I don't really care about Hegel per se. I mean, but the category. I mean, what I am interested in is, why I'm kind of obsessed with modality here, is to think about a possibility that is not. I mean, so for Hegel, possibility only is ratified as possibility in some sense if it's ratified retroactively by what it enables or what it actualizes, and an unrealized possibility is not a possibility; it's an impossibility. That's the bad infinite, basically. That. So yeah. So what I'm trying to think about vis-a-vis revolution is to really free the category of possibility from its actualization, so that retroactively, a counterfactual can be, some kind of counterfactual can be rescued from a history which would otherwise just be, well, if it didn't happen, it couldn't happen.
Is this the process in searching the subject, or is this a process which is its own subject?
No, I think. You think?
I don't know.
I don't think the process can be its own subject, because it would just be, that just seems too autotelic and self-sufficient and not restless enough. So I think it has to be in search, in that there's something missing, there's something lacking, and it has to, it would not be movement if there were not something outside that movement. Otherwise, we're just circling around, like bad revolution, just circling around itself. Great.
Yeah, thanks, Rebecca. I just, it's really a question about the analogy between Hegel's spirit and Marx's mole, and if you can maybe unpack it a little bit more, because it's striking that Hegel says, the mole, the mole qua Hegel's spirit, pushes through the crust of the earth that has separated it from the sun, from its sun, its concept. Mm-hmm. Okay, so it's burrowing up, to try to kind of pierce through the crust of the earth to the concept. And in Hegel, it's spirit is nothing but the concept of spirit. So, but then for Marx, when he talks about, well, certainly when he talks about communism as real movement, he says it's a real movement and not a concept. Mm-hmm. So in other words, the reason why it's not kind of teleologically ordained, the reason why kind of communism is not kind of straightforwardly kind of, mechanically driven towards realization, is because it's a real movement, and this real movement. I'm really asking about what distinguishes communism as real movement from revolution, because revolution is a genus of which there are many species. There's and the bourgeois revolution, and the kind of it's precisely the bourgeois revolution that is subject to these mechanical reversals. It plays out, or it collapses into these merely mechanical. It's the mechanization of dialectics that leads to the kind of that he's describing in number number two.
Yeah.
So on the one hand, so there's a sense in which Marx is strongly against this kind of mechanical or teleological reinscription of dialectics, but he says, but this personification of revolution in the figure of the mole in number 4, I mean, you're right that it's in a way it has to have an orientation, because in a way there is a kind of a conceptual guarantor for the objectivity of social contradiction, which propels the real movement, and that is the claim, the moving contradiction, the claim that capitalism is contradictory because it's compelled to extract greater and greater magnitudes of surplus value from less and less necessary labor. And this is an objective, the tendency, the falling rate of profit means that why there is, this system is self-destructive. It's not socially sustainable. But this doesn't guarantee communism, because it can also kind of issue in the ruin of the contending classes. So my question is in one sense, if we take the disanalogy between the mole and the spirit, is that the indefinite, the earth that the mole is kind of burrowing through is the indefinite disintegrated mass of the lumpen. So in other words, it's not simply kind of, it's precisely not kind of, it doesn't see, it's not guided by the sun. It's not compelled to kind of, to...
Hegel's mole, talking about.
Marx's mole is burrowing through this kind of, through the earth, but it doesn't, it doesn't see the result, the kind of, it doesn't kind of see or envisage, the communist revolution that it's kind of, that is nevertheless kind of blindly kind of, in a way, its blind burrowing is still generating or kind of, propelling the result. So in other words, I'm talking about, is there a tendency can be kind of, can have a direction and an orientation without having a kind of
goal.
A goal.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. And I mean, and the most blindness is, can be very overstated because it's highly, it's highly sensitive. It has other modalities. So it's not kind of, it's just not seeing, but it has, exquisite tactile and acoustic and vibratory. So it's certainly oriented. We don't know where it's going, but yes, it's not a visionary in that sense, and so how does it? Yeah, how does it work? I mean, the Hamlet thing is really interesting. Actually, if I could just revert to that for a second, because the mole is. The mole is kind of really messing everybody up because it keeps changing location. So in a way, it's stage director. It's there, like everybody's following it around. So there's some sense in which nobody can keep up with it. Like nobody can keep up with the revolution. If the revolution is a mole, it's just like it's by the time it's discovered. I mean, you can in a paranoid universe, you can be in counter. You can, you have counter-revolution all over the place. You have the forces of counterinsurgency, and you can anticipate every eruption. But But the mole is, that's a kind of preemptive bit. And whereas the mole is always surfaces in a way that is discovered after the fact, and that's part of the, if there's a strategy, I don't even know how conscious of strategy, but that's kind of how the temporality would work. Now, so wait a minute, where are we going with this?
The difference between or the question of different revolutions.
So Hegel's, Hegel's mole is not, it's looking to the sun, which is totally the opposite of what mole should be doing anyway. But it's groping, for Hegel it would be groping blindly, but then retroactively full of vision. Because that's just how vision works. So it discovers that it discovers that it will have always known all along that it was following the light of reason, even if it didn't know that. So it actually is always oriented to the sun. But the delay, that's why it was kind of like just lingering on this patch where suddenly it gets to the sun, it's taken so long, and it has to hurry up, do this synthesis. You have to put on these boots and, fly over all the centuries and get it together, which is kind of an acknowledgement of the fact that it can't catch up with itself. So there's this, so that would be, Hegel and Marx are completely at one in this regard. There's no image of the future. Hegel's Owl of Minerva is basically Marx's proscription of the utopian socialists, who are dreaming of a future, prescribing something which actually can only be discovered in the making, and there is no, communism is not an ideal, but it's the real movement that abolishes the current, So they're both, they're both on track as far as that goes. That there's no, any imagination, any depiction would be a kind of fetishism and an extension, and thereby an extrapolation, an extension of the present, and consolidation of the present, because our imaginations are so thwarted and stifled. I think vision-wise, I think they're both on par.
Just very simply, I'm suggesting, is it necessary to have, if you give up on Marx's identification of the contradiction in Capital, if you give that up, then the claim is that you cannot but have this relapse into mechanical reversal, because then you have a revolution which gives up, gets rid of teleology, but it gets rid of tendency and orientation, and then you have, in a way like, that Marx's or, post-structuralist critics, they want to get rid of, they get rid of too much, and if Marx is clear that kind of the, classes are constituted through struggle. They don't pre-exist the struggle, they're generated through the antagonism, but this antagonism is propelled by contradiction, and that's a conceptual insight, So the claim would be that unless you can conceptually identify a contradiction, you cannot you cannot turn antagonism into struggle, Because antagonism will always be there, but you need the contradiction to focus the antagonism. And in a way, that would be what has to orient revolution. And so the revolution, the personification of the revolution, is grasping the link between contradiction and antagonism. And in a way, once you get rid of contradiction, you've got antagonism, but no revolution.
Exactly. And that's the problem with the whole thing. Can you have, if you have antagonism that doesn't crystallize and focalize into contradiction, which has to be binary. There's such thing as contradiction if it's not two terms. That would just be, that would just be conflict. So without that simplification, can you think of revolution without that kind of, without antagonism, without contradiction? Is it still revolution? Does revolution require that binary? Can you have a binary? Can you have contradiction which is not teleological in its form? Tendency is not teleology, nor is it reformism. Or not necessarily.
Jens, I think this will be our last question. if that's okay, unless there's a very pressing one after this. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe just, hi Rebecca.
Hi.
Wonderful, thank you so much. The discussion about the mole has gotten me thinking about this analogy in a non-dialectical, non-contradictory terms, and I dug up an old article I wrote about Kafka and Arabs, and the figure of the mole in Kafka, in the burrow, or the Riesen Maulwurf, this teacher, this village teacher.
Yeah.
But the burrow, exactly. And the burrow in Kafka, and I had to dig it up in my article, it's been a while, is in Kafka's reading, this mole or badger is constantly afraid, is burrowed in and is afraid from some force above the ground, and is sort of almost suffering paranoia. In Kafka.
Yeah, it's
I mean,
kind of a
Kafka is more as this is not farce and tragedy. This is absurd, going into certainly the non-dialectic form of making analogies, I guess. And I came across the burrow because I read the Rasail, the letters between Samih al-Qasim and Darwish in Paris in the 80s. They had this famous exchange. And Al-Qasim says we must stop being like the burrow, like, I guess the analogy would be we Palestinians, should see the light. We should get out of our paranoia. We should, rise above the ground. I mean, this is how I interpreted it. We can go back to the Rasail. So this is sort of a Kafka sort of take, I guess, on the mole, which I guess doesn't fit the sort of, I guess, a dialectic way of conceiving of the mole. It's sort of more paradoxical or absurd, perhaps.
Well, it's certainly more sedentary. I mean, the burrow is architecture. I mean, it's pure architecture and of an acoustic sort. I mean, it's just listening and hearing noises and just and going insane. But it's entirely sedentary. I mean, it's someone in a bunker who loves his burrow, and who loves his burrow to the point that he actually likes standing outside his burrow so he can imagine what it's like to be inside his burrow. So he kind of puts himself in danger to appreciate how safe he is, how solid his burrow is. So I don't think it's a mole. I think it's something else. It's like a hamster.
Okay. I mean, we're at 7. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for taking all these questions, for the talk, and for being here. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. And I hope you join us for the rest of the talks. We have a talk tomorrow at the same time in the same room by Lisa Udin. On Friday, we have 2 talks. One by Ozren Popovac and the other by Aboud Hamail. So I hope you can make it to all